what I'm going to do is just talk about, I guess, like the links that exist between the work we've been doing here and the ideas that Chris has raised in relation to this notion of how we have to, the role of experimentation in terms of freeing ourselves from the paradigms that we've been operating in and the kinds of rule sets that to this point have very much almost taken over the process of the kind of imagining of the future, or even the sort of control that we expect to have over what we'd like the future to be. And as Chris has observed, this dissonance between the kinds of futures that people would like to have and the kinds of futures that they feel are going to be visited upon them. And so I've broken my presentation, which is really about the process that we've gone through here in Leeuwarden with the work that's finally ended up in the exhibition, and just some examples. And I've broken this work into 4 stages. So a lot of this is not necessarily work that's on the boards, but it was work that led to those outcomes, the kind of processes. And in a way, of course, the first question that people would ask is, what are a group of Australians or people from elsewhere coming to Leeuwarden? What role could we have to play in talking to you about something that here you know a great deal more about? And one of the critical reasons for that, or an answer that's been given, is that because we are not so embedded in what's going on here, we bring a set of fresh ideas. They could be naive, they could be ideas, or there could be a way of thinking which is clearly outside of the knowledge of what is possible, what is permissible here. So in a sense, it's our naivety that can be very interesting in terms of the sorts of questions that we ask. And so this sort of this proposition around fresh ideas. So the first one that came up was from our team working on one of the water projects. Why aren't water taxis a thing? Why aren't water taxis something that you're very heavily embedded in working with? You've got all this water, you've got all these canals, you've got all these water systems. How is that possible? Now, it may be that, of course, there are lots of reasons why that is not a good idea. But by unlocking the box, if you like, stepping outside of the rules as you know them, we can begin to explore ideas which might, meshed with other ideas, begin to suggest possibilities that are just not entertainable here by someone who's very well versed in what is actually likely to be possible. So it can often be that, if you like, our naivety, our not knowing, in effect, precisely what's going on, or what has gone before, or what people automatically accept, can be very significant in terms of the contribution that we can begin the process. We're interested in asking questions, and a lot of this is just is research. A lot of it, of course, you already know, but it's very interesting. The team looking at statistics, and there were some really lovely statistics that emerged around things like transport, because of course Holland is known for your extraordinary use of buses. Turns out you use cars more than any other European nation. And these things become really, really interesting. How is that? What does that give us in terms of options? What does that mean in terms of the kinds of decisions people are making locally? Of course, there's a lot of stuff, the International Energy Commission agency looking at where energy is being generated in various parts of the world, what is happening here, what are the regimes, the operations, and Chris has talked about the systems of provision. And we need, obviously, to very quickly, it's a crash course in trying to understand these things, and sometimes we stumble upon really interesting bits of information. And here's an example which was really fascinating, that the blockhouse fort was like a classic fort surrounded by a moat, and there was a canal running, and I can't remember the name of this particular street, I should remember it. That's been a very interesting thing for us, because you also realise that we walk into a city like Leeuwarden and there are all these signs all over the buildings, 1621, 1635. There's nothing in Australia that's over sort of 200 years. 150 years is considered historic.
60,000.
60,000, of course, is the real number, but that is not something we contemplate well enough, often.
We don't have it over our doors.
No, we don't have it over our doors. And it's important to understand that things have not always been as they appear to be now. What is there in this that may be really valuable about thinking about the future? So that when we look at something like Dahomey And the Harmony is a very significant building in this town. It is an architectural masterpiece. It's won awards, and it's an iconic building, and it talks to Leeuwarden's commitment to a future. And so when we look at it, and our team and the students that are with us, master students who are studying architecture and designing buildings, and they go, it's really weird. This building is completely the wrong scale. Look at this town, these beautiful, these buildings with 1631 and 1635 and 1740 or whatever. And look at this building, it's like a huge, gigantic sort of industrial factory stuck in the middle of the town. Now, that doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but it means that it may be something worth contemplating. There may be things when you start trying to ask, why is it that this area is always so empty? Why does it feel, why aren't there people aggregating there? We walked around the town the other day, enjoying this incredibly unseasonable Australian weather at the moment, and we're noticing that all of the lovely little cafes and sort of byways in the town are full of people. They're outside, they're sunning themselves, and you come down here, it's completely empty. And we're looking at it, and this is one of the most beautiful parts of town. It's got an incredible view. There are all these people in the garden around here, and then there's nothing happening here. And that just seems to our fresh eyes as, how is it possible that something that seems to have all of the right elements and the right location and aspect, why is that somehow or other not being occupied and not a focus? And so here's a diagrammatic exploration about the fact that there's a totally different scale around, and are there ways in which, are there things that you could do which would transform this difference in scale that might be valuable in terms of shifting it as a resource for the town? And what might that mean, and what could it become? And here's another set of research. What about greenery in lots of the hard surface areas? What does that mean? Is it possible? Now, you might say, look, that's simply never going to work because there's just so much moisture here that anything that's green in the middle of these larger areas, it's likely just to turn to slush. But because we're not as well versed in understanding all of the challenges, we might throw these ideas up. It may turn out that in fact there are ways of controlling moisture, and there are ways of softening these larger green areas that are actually very effective. But again, it's a kind of proposition that gets put on the table. And here are a series of observations around, this was work being done in relation to the blockhouse sport and thinking about structures and the kind of language. And obviously there's an interest in Escher and the way in which space is unpacked, and how does that start to resonate with things which in many respects get linked to shapes that are part of things like wind generators, and a kind of industrial language in terms of interior spaces. So there are these kind of maps that we find ourselves and our team generating that come as inspiration from walking around the town, and they're not likely to be things that that the inhabitants of Leeuwarden would necessarily automatically gravitate to. But they can be grouped together and linked in ways where there can be stories that can be told or unpacked from these that become possible pathways to think about how alternate design opportunities or options could be put on the table. There was a lovely project called the Lily Pad Canopy, which was part of the Cultural Capital Program, that was put on the table as something that was being developed locally when we were first here, working with the Cultural Capital Program. And again, that sparked a lot of interest around, obviously it's something that exists here in its natural form. It's already got really interesting application architecturally on a grand scale, but there are also other kinds of spaces that a lot of our team had experienced as these little sort of sheltered places. So this kind of bringing other kinds of references to the table, sometimes these give rise to really interesting options, other times they just turn out to be dead ends. They turn out to be things that aren't going to be effective observations. So in talking to local people, often we find very interesting observations, very interesting comments that get made that we start to think, oh, here's someone who's in town, can't find a job, but it's not the atmosphere either. When we start compiling these things, these can begin to inform the way we think about the town in a slightly different way. So this then gives rise to what kinds of experimental thinking might that sort of this perspective of the fresh idea give rise to. And this was one of the outcomes from the discussion around blockhouse sport. Are there ways you can change the flow of the traffic such that you can begin to liberate some of the boundaries of a particular site? And this would also be true for a place like Neushorn, the boundary between Neushorn and De Harmony, where the bus flies through, and yet it's a very interesting precinct. This sort of thing. The water taxis. So in thinking about that the water is such an important part of the city, just as it is with many, many cities in the Netherlands. Come on in. Come and join us. There's a whole lot of technology floating around that may be of real interest in terms of if we start imagining that the role of water starts to take on a more active use in terms of the way people get around. And of course, some of that can lead to completely unfettered and wild imaginings. So little pods and little cabs and things floating around. What happens, again, as Chris pointed out with one of his slides, when you start getting, urban agriculture happening in the streets and these tiny electric pods? What does that look like? Is that something that people are interested in? Here, the idea of connection. We've got the really interesting sort of energy park site. We've got Blockhouse Sport here. What does it look like when you start imagining a map of this town that's a kind of water map with water freeways going through it? And at the moment, we see in summer, we see tourists coming from other part of Europe on boats making their way through the city. And it's very beautiful. And it's something that I think is the envy of lots of other parts of Europe where you don't have water integrated into the city. But I guess our question is, are there ways in which it could be used more continuously? Does this represent a sort of very interesting opportunity where we could actually unpack that as a resource? And again, this the image that Chris put up too, asking about other kinds of resources that might be brought in, such as hybrid programs around new manufacturing and collective amenities. Are they here? Are they not here? Should there be more of them? What should they be? Where should they go? Which then leads to things like this, where a number of our team were looking at the Aegon building, now of course owned by Leighton and being developed, and saying, well, if we were to start to think about a diagram like that, what does it look like when you start taking a building that's a large commercial office and turning it into 3D printing labs? What kind of culture would we like, what kind of population would we like to draw into the town? This was obviously done with the idea around the cultural capital program, but again, it's synthesizing different kinds of elements using the spaces that everyone here is familiar with, but imagining what happens when different communities get together for different kinds of cultural activities. And then of course we come to, well, okay, programming cultural activities. What happens when you pick a particular site? Again, this is the energy park. Let's think about a calendar of events for that year. And of course we can do this in terms of a kind of experimental framework, because we're not the ones at this point putting a program together. We're not the ones, either with council or the province or any of the other stakeholders, actually having to activate this site. So we're very interested, what does it look like when you start to do this? What do you get? What kinds of experiences occur? And then at the other end, we've got things like this very much admired car park in front of the Alderhoop in the square, and it's part of an updating of Leeuwarden, allowing cars to be brought into the city. And we're looking at it and saying, well, if we look at some of these other things we're looking at and thinking about the activation of the town in terms of events and the kind of activation that the Cultural Capital Program brought, and if there's a legacy there and if we're going to move that forward, can we start using spaces in a way where they're being used to support ongoing cultural activities, a kind of program of cultural activity, which means the car park, and this is obviously with its lid taken off, gets turned into various pop-up events. What does the city start to look like if there are going to be, sequences of events occurring annually that are bringing people into the city for cultural reasons? And this is, again, looking at the idea of it's just an elevation and showing the Harmony building with a series of those small buildings at the front. The Leeuwarden pine with canopies, and again coming back to that lily pad model. What happens if we start thinking about adding more shelter to public space? As we've seen, there's often a thinking here that really public space needs to be kept as open as possible, because there will be a couple of days a year when you need to put 10,000 people, and you can't possibly go and put things on it because that would make that not possible. And we're saying, but hang on, what about if you've got a lot of easily implementable infrastructure that provides a degree of shelter from various kinds of climatic conditions? Could that really transform the way these spaces are being used in a way that was very positive for the city? And again, the lovely Leeuwarden, one of the projects we were looking at was, imagine that the Leeuwarden is a kind of projector. Imagine that if the Leeuwarden historically was the sort of control gate for all of the commerce running through the town, helping to make the town rich, and really connecting with the town is a very important part of the northern Silk Road through Friesland. That it has a new role now, and it has a role which is kind of digital and based on projecting information. And this was part of a project looking at that, which I've got an image of a bit later on. So, starting with fresh ideas, moving through to this notion of what kind of experimental ideas could be put on the table, then how do these look as propositions? And I think very critical in the processes that we're interested in, that we've wanted to bring to the table in terms of Eco Acupuncture here and the work that's shown in the exhibition, is how we can engage with the larger community. And this comes back to this issue of the sort of dissonance about imagining the future as being one that you're not going to like. This notion, if we can put alternative possibilities down, with experimentation we can try a range of options. None of these are going to be the future, but if they begin to unpack a set of broader possibilities, then a conversation can start. A conversation can start between members of the community, between the community and city council, developers, province, etc. And this gives rise, obviously, to propositions like again, picking up on the reworking the movement of traffic and cycling around the blockhouse sport, and putting in, can we do things to reinforce a bicycle lane around the edge, whether or not reinstating a tower, what that at blockhouse sport, what that might look like, and this was a tower proposition related very much to the cultural capital program. But again, it's about celebratory architecture that might relate to particular programs that could be brought in. Here we've got the proposition as it unfolded in relation to Harmony, where we took the idea of the smaller scale of the architecture around the Harmony and started to populate it. And this has already happened, in fact, with the pavilion that's been put in the front of the Harmony. In this particular project, our team were really saying, but you've got an incredible manufacturing sector in the Netherlands for producing small modular buildings that are delightful. Greenhouses. What about looking at unpacking the typology of greenhouses and just bringing a whole range of them in? And this was again something that was being proposed for the cultural capital program, but more broadly could be used in terms of thinking about how to release the potential of that area around the Harmony. This is a similar kind of idea, but this is down near the water campus. And an idea that's come very much from sort of Asian model of water markets and boats that can pull up, and either pull up because there's entertainment or because there's a market designed expressly to serve boats. Coming back to the energy park, thinking about how we could use that as a site for events, for annual events, an annual energy expo. And this was something that had been discussed quite a lot with Yoko Ice at one stage, and certainly in our initial engagement we were thinking that this could be something that might be part of the cultural capital program. Further work on what do fab labs look like, 3D printing amenities, and how they can be packed into existing buildings. When you start thinking about these kinds of systems, what do they actually require in order to work? And again, I think we have the opportunity in this process to experiment and test with ideas that, in a way, people with their naturally embedded commitments working in either often within the council or within the province, or as even the developers and stakeholders, it's very difficult. There's often no time to explore these ideas. There are deadlines, or there are simply barriers that really make these ideas something that are too difficult to contemplate. But we've used the notion of the work here to say, if there is opportunity to explore these, then you really begin to unpack the range of possibilities, and you open up the spectrum of possible futures. It does allow a richer conversation about where the city can go. Similarly, again, for us, this was Overholder, the idea that, and this was one of our early proposals, at that point, this was before the decision was made to put a pavilion on the square. But again, thinking about how could a square like this be reimagined that allowed those few days of the year when you want 10,000 people on the square to make sure that that's possible, but a space that could be enjoyed on beautiful afternoons like yesterday afternoon, with a degree of intimacy and a set of sort of smaller spaces that people might enjoy. This is a proposed canopy over the existing car park in that area, and thinking about possibly ways of connecting these underground spaces to the above ground spaces in ways that might be beneficial to the way that a square like that was used. This is thinking about what the underground space might be. Again, this is part of the cultural capital program, thinking of reimagining a kind of dynamic set of platforms for, this was obviously for the cultural capital, the L'Enfantal program, but how one starts to create a kind of infrastructure, an agile infrastructure that can be used to support bigger programs for events to happen during the year. And this is, again, I guess, thinking around this notion of what can come out of the cultural capital year. What are the kinds of things that are being, I guess, presented and discussed at this very moment around the figures that have come out of the cultural capital program? How can they be embedded into the future of this town in a way that, or this city, that can support a bigger range of activities that can help build the city positively, and also in ways that are going to make it sustainable. So this is the last part of my presentation, just some of the visualizations that emerge from this kind of thinking. One that we particularly liked, this idea of playing with the surfaces, playing with the introduction of sort of mini terps in public spaces, what that might provide in terms of amenity, the way of softening some of the harder spaces. At least what this represents is a way of another way of imagining how these spaces might be as a starting point for further discussion around these options. Here is the fabulous the Harmony building with a series of these smaller pavilions in front of it. There was enormous concern from local stakeholders that you can't do anything with the Harmony building because it's such an important icon. You can't put anything in front of it. But in fact, if this is a render designed view from the other bank, showing that in fact the building can sustain a series of smaller interventions across the front of it without losing its sort of iconic status, and that those smaller pavilions can begin to suggest that this becomes a kind of urban lounge room, and something where, from our perspective and the thinking we wanted to bring to the table, suggested that this was a really rich space that you could occupy. The Varg as a projection facility, projected on and projecting from, how this is a sort of very magical kind of interpretation of that space, but for us, it was thinking about, that's a very lovely urban area. Is that a kind of space that's appropriate for this very intense mapping of images and festive elements. Again, Chris showed this, the floating bike path, ways of playing with your infrastructure, but making them iconic and making them singular, and drawing out the DNA of the city in ways that create a focus on its unique character, where you're using architecture and design to really amplify that. This is again the old Herbert Square, a visualization with our proposed elevated edge ramp, and trying to show that it was still able to be used very effectively for concerts and these larger events. The energy park, again, we've got our set of events scheduled for the year, and just thinking about the transformation of that landscape through the year as these different festivals are occurring, and trying to connect investment with infrastructure with a cultural program that is very much built around sustainability, sustainable exploration and experimentation and new technology. Visualizations of some of the proposals that we were suggesting for the Ergon building, and it being a kind of hotel for entrepreneurs and startups and 3D printing labs. And there's very lovely architectural elements within the building, and what happens if you start to bring in a kind of layer of infrastructure. So I'll finish again, as I think Chris did on this particular slide. For us, what's been very exciting about this process here in Leeuwarden is that the city has wonderful bones, and it has an extraordinary community that's very interested in wanting to build a very significant city, a city that's got an extraordinary past. And are there ways that we can use this process of experimental thinking and bringing these in as Eco Acupuncture, as experiments, to really capture the potential of this city to build it as a sort of transformative hub, an attractor for new ideas, new cultural exploration, and build on what is a very strong base, but in a way which is very imaginative and which is about exploring opportunities and taking risks and trying to build a really fascinating and unique future for the city. Thank you.